Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. It's a survey of world history, not very deep. You can go deeper, but I pray that you will know about these items I talk about, these people, places, events, concepts, and battles and social things, and that even though you might not agree with my conclusions or you might not be a Bible believer, that's fine. You will at least know about them. So um, we're going to begin with Northwestern Europe today. So uh, in the British Isles, Wales was a refuge for many Roman Britons of Celtic stock from the Anglo-Saxon invasion of England. It had been converted to Christianity early on, perhaps as early as the first century, by the missionaries Pudens and Claudia, who had come under the ministry of Paul while in Rome, according to J. Davis in his History of the Welsh Baptists. Studying Schaff's History of the Christian Church, Ruckman's History of the New Testament Church, and Durant shows that Christianity came early to the British Isles, was unique, and clearly showed the influence of Antioch and the early apostolic Christians, and only later, by diplomacy, threats, and force, came under the dominion of the Roman Church. In the 6th century, Roman Catholicism was imposed on Wales. The Welsh, the people of Wales, were politically united under King Hywel the Good, and I didn't pronounce his name right because Welsh names do not sound like they're written. Okay, so it's definitely you could Hywel, the Good, who ruled between 910 and 950, provided them with a unified code of laws. Gruffydd ap Llywelyn defeated the English country of Mercia, which in turn resulted in the conquest of Wales for the English by King Harold in 1063. After the death of Patrick and until the 11th century, Ireland was divided into 7 kingdoms. 3 in Ulster, which is the proper name for what we call Northern Ireland today, Connaught, Leinster, Munster, and Meath. They fought among themselves and quite early also raided the British coast. The chronicles called these raiders Scots, a Celtic word for wanderer, which referred in the early part of the first millennium AD to the Irish. Government was tribal, warfare was endemic or common, and the family was the supreme governing entity. Several families made a clan, several clans made a tribe. The prefixes UI or O began to be affixed to a tribal name to indicate descent from a common ancestor about the 9th century or the 800s. For instance, the O'Neills claimed descent from Neil Glundubh, King of Ireland in 916. Early Christian monks opened schools of every scope and degree, including studies in Bible, Latin, Greek, and Gaelic grammar. Gaelic is the native language of Ireland. Poor students in the English language, a student used to be called a scholar or a teacher, master. See 1 Chronicles 25:8 and Malachi 2:12 in the Authorized Version. Poor students were maintained by public funds as the Irish made every sacrifice to encourage literacy and learning. Talking about poor students as in poor social class, not poor bad students, can't read. The time before Rome took control could hardly be called the Dark Ages in Ireland. Ireland was united under the great King Brian Boru between 941 and 1014. Politically and materially, they may have been far behind their contemporaries by our standards, but culturally, they were the most advanced in the West until 1172, when the English or Anglo-Norman King Henry II, under the authority of a papal bull of the English Pope Adrian IV, invaded Ireland for Rome and England. Ireland has suffered much since that time. I have in my possession 3 large books, one called Ireland and Poetry, as Ireland had a long, profoundly deep and literate poetic history, and Irish Legends and Legendary Ireland, showing pictures and relating stories of Irish mythology and mythic history. The tribes of Scotland, once called Caledonia, among them the Celtic Picts, had been so hard to conquer that Roman Empire had built a wall separating them from the rest of Britain, called Hadrian's Wall. Late in the 5th century, the 400s, a tribe of Gaelic Scotti from Northern Ireland migrated there and basically took over. 3 other groups of people, Picts, Briton refugees from the Anglo-Saxon invasion, and Anglo-Saxons themselves, competed for the area of Scotland. In 617, Saxons under Edwin, king of Northumbria, captured a hilltop stronghold of the Picts and named it Edwinburgh. It was retaken by Picts and Scots in 954 and made the capital. Malcolm II united much of Scotland in 1018. Duncan the First, between 1034 and 1040, united Picts, Scots, Celtic Britons, and Anglo-Saxon settlers into one kingdom of Scotland. Duncan was defeated by the English at Durham and murdered by his general Macbeth in 1040, who reigned for 17 years and was murdered by Duncan's son, Malcolm III. He also had a play written about him by Shakespeare. You might have heard about it. One of the 17 kings who ruled Scotland from 1844 to 1057, of them, 12 died by assassination. Further south, the German Anglo-Saxon invasion had hardly been successful over the Celtic Britons. I highly recommend a book called The Isles by Norman Davies. When another invader, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, began their bloody work. According to Durant, the Northmen or Norsemen, also known as the Vikings, were Teutonic Germans whose ancestors had moved from the general area of the Anglo-Saxons. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Whose ancestors had come from they moved from the Germanic area into Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, displacing the Celtic population who had displaced a Mongolian population who were related to Eskimos and Laplanders. Now, Lapland is the northernmost cultural region of Scandinavia. Dan Michelati, an early chieftain, gave his name to Denmark, or Dansmark, or province. Sweden came from Tacitus's Suones, and Norway was simply the Norge, or Northern Way. I would also recommend Gwen Jones' A History of the Vikings. Gorm gave Denmark unity and ruled in the late 9th century. That's 800s, early 1900s. And early 10th century, Harold Bluetooth, his son, gave it Christianity between 945 and 985. Sven Forkbeard conquered England between 985 and 1014 and made Denmark one of the great powers of Europe for a time. King Olaf Skotkonung made Sweden nominally Christian sometime between 994 and 1022. In the mid-800s, Norway, a conglomeration of 31 principalities ruled by a warrior chieftain, was almost all united under Halfdan the Black, who became the first king. His son, Harold Harfager, between 860 and 933, conquered the rest of it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a long history of the people who invaded Roman Britain, declares that in 787, before England had been united under Anglo-Saxon rule, quote, came 3 ships to the West Saxon shores, and they slew folk. These were the first ships of Danish men that sought the land of Englefolk, unquote. In 793, a Danish expedition sacked the famous monastery of Lindisfarne and murdered its monks. In 838, East Anglia and Kent were raided, and in 839, a pirate fleet of 350 ships moored in the Thames River and sacked Canterbury and London. Monasteries were destroyed, libraries were burnt, and cities ruined. By 871, most of England north of the Thames River was Viking. Then at age 22, a great English king rose to the throne of West Saxony, a man named Alfred, who would become known as Alfred the Great. He would translate part of the Bible and carry it with him. He was possibly an epileptic, suffering a seizure at a wedding feast, but he is portrayed as a hunter, handsome and graceful, Durant tells us, and surpassed all of his family in the warrior arts and wisdom. After being defeated by the Danes, he managed to turn the tables in 878 at the Battle of Eddington. Half of the Danish invaders moved to attack France, and the other half agreed to stay within a limited area of northeastern England and called Danelaw. He then conquered the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, uniting them against the invaders, rebuilt his army, built a navy, established common law for all of his kingdoms, reformed the administration of justice, provided legal protection for the poor, and built or rebuilt towns and cities. In 894, a fresh invasion of Danes allied with Welsh Celts, not yet conquered by the Anglo-Saxons, was defeated by Alfred's son, Edward's army and navy. Alfred died in or about 899 at comparatively young, by our standards, 50 to 52 years of age. At the end of the 900s, another Scandinavian assault resulted in victory and the forcing of King Ethelred to pay a tribute to the conquerors, which became known as the Danegeld. Later, after ordering the slaughter of many of the Danes, he fled to Normandy when King Sven of Denmark conquered England in revenge. Ethelred had married the daughter of the Norman Duke Richard I. The Normans were also descendants of Viking conquerors on the west coast of France. By 1016, the invasion of England by Canute the Dane was complete. Canute. Before we move on to the continent during this era, I want to mention some important Anglo-Saxon literature. The history known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, already mentioned. Another is the epic poem Beowulf. Alfred's life is preserved in the Life of Alfred by Asser, A-S-S-E-R. Cadman is the oldest name of a poet on record of Anglo-Saxon origin, preserved only by comments of the Venerable Bede in his ecclesiastical history. Next, we'll go on to Continental Europe. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll do some studying on your own. Thank you.